HMS Onslow and her convoy were on the brink of annihilation in the freezing black void of Arctic waters. Robert Sherbrooke's small destroyer was ambushed by a massive German heavy cruiser, her opening salvo shredding Onslow's bridge. Dozens lost their lives in a flash. Sherbrooke, now blinded and gravely injured, clung to command. With just 6 destroyers against a German force boasting a heavy battlecruiser, a pocket battleship, and 6 destroyer escorts, survival seemed impossible. But Sherbrooke refused to let the convoy and its precious cargo sink. Blind, yet unafraid, he ordered an attack. Smokescreens billowed, desperate maneuvers buying precious moments for the merchant ships to flee. Frantic calls to HMS Sheffield and Jamaica, the British cruisers meant to protect them, painted a dire picture. The cruisers had overshot by 30 miles after a storm scattered the convoy. As shell after shell tore through the frigid air around HMS Onslow, Sherbrooke knew his destroyers could not withstand the German onslaught forever. His only chance lay in buying precious minutes, holding out until HMS Sheffield and HMS Jamaica could reach them. Until then, his destroyers would have to weather this storm, no matter the cost. On December 22, 1942, as Christmas approached, the frigid, wind-whipped decks of 14 merchant ships departing from Loch Ewe, Scotland, into the Arctic waters were the last place those British sailors wanted to be. Convoy JW 51B carried precious cargo for the Soviet port of Murmansk: 202 tanks, 2,046 vehicles, 87 fighters, 33 bombers, and over 54,000 tons of essential war supplies. Some barely seaworthy ships creaked and groaned under the weight as they plunged headfirst into the raging seas. Their escort, consisting of 8 destroyers, a minesweeper, and 3 corvettes, offered little comfort in terms of defense. The wind picked up as the ships cleared the harbor and entered the Minch Channel, and storms gathered in the distance. The men huddled in their cramped, damp quarters, feeling the Arctic cold seep into their bones. On the bridge of HMS Onslow, Robert Sherbrooke, the man in charge of the entire operation, peered into the inky blackness. In these waters, with the sun barely lifted above the horizon for more than a few minutes, they relied on dead reckoning, a crude, imprecise navigation method using the ship's speed and course to estimate location. It was all they had. Worse still, they knew these waters teemed with German U-boats, ready to ambush Allied ships or reveal their positions to the German high seas fleet. To reduce the risk of a mass attack, the convoy's escort had been split into 2 groups, making detection by the Kriegsmarine harder, but leaving each group more vulnerable if found. Convoy JW-51A had sailed days earlier, leaving JW-51B to fend for itself. As the ships battled through rough seas, the men tried to keep their spirits up. In the tanker Empire Emerald, the crew sang and told stories, trying to forget they were sitting on a floating bomb with 7,400 tons of aviation fuel and 2,580 tons of oil on their holds. One torpedo could turn their ship into a raging inferno. By nightfall, the weather worsened. Gale-force winds reaching 50 knots battered the convoy, sending massive waves crashing over the decks. The ships, their hulls encrusted with ice, struggled to stay on course. By the next morning, the destroyer Bulldog, weakened by the relentless waves, was forced to turn back due to significant hull damage and mechanical issues, leaving the already cruiserless convoy more exposed than ever. The voyage grew increasingly perilous, yet the mission had to press on. The stakes were enormous. In Russia, the city of Stalingrad was under siege, and the Soviets, on the cusp of a major victory, desperately needed these resources to crush the entrapped German Sixth Army and begin their push toward Berlin. On December 29th, a brutal Arctic storm slammed into convoy JW-51B on a night Sherbrooke described as, quote, as black as a lion's throat. Towering waves assaulted the British escorts, and blinding squalls lashed the decks at HMS Onslow, where sailors fought to keep her steady. Amid the darkness and crashing seas, Onslow narrowly avoided a collision with HMS Orwell, veering away at the last moment with only 20 feet to spare. Buffeted and scattered, the convoy fragmented. HMS Oribe found itself with at least 5 merchant ships drifting further from the core. After the storm, Sherbrooke dispatched the minesweeper Bramble, one of the fleet's few radar-equipped ships, to search for the missing vessels, but she found nothing. By December 30th, with the convoy 8 days out from Loch Ewe, officers were gravely concerned about the missing ships. They slowed the convoy to a sluggish 6 knots, giving the stragglers a chance to catch up. On deck, every man chipped away at the ice sheet, which rendered gun positions unusable. Finally, at midday, good news arrived. Bramble had spotted 2 of the lost merchant ships in the distance. Sherbrooke sent HMS Obdurate to shepherd them back into formation. But just as the missing ships rejoined the convoy at 12:40 p.m., German submarine U-354 under Lieutenant Hirschlib rose to periscope depth. The sound of the missing ships had led him straight into the midst of a weakened British convoy. It seemed to be barely holding together. It was ripe for the picking. Hirschlib's discovery was massive. He wasted no time, making radio contact with Karl Dönitz himself to report the convoy's position, course, and speed. Describing it as weakly escorted, and even more astonishingly, without a single light cruiser for defense, Hirschlib's report set the gears of the German war machine into motion. At that exact moment in Hitler's Wolfslayer, the Führer was tearing into his high command, his voice echoing with fury, quote, "Our own navy is but a copy of the British, and a poor one at that. The warships are not in operational readiness. They are lying idle in the fjords, utterly useless, like so much old iron." Admiral Theodor Krank sat rigidly, silent. He knew better than to interrupt Hitler's tirades, but the insult to the Navy cut deep. The accusations of failure, allowing endless supply runs to Murmansk, despite a fleet stationed in Norway for that very purpose, gnawed at him. Finally, Krank rose. The report in his hand couldn't wait. He delivered the news. A British convoy had been discovered. Hitler's rant stopped cold, quote, "Can the force get there in time and locate the convoy?" Krank replied, quote, "It is possible, my Führer." Rear Admiral Oscar Kummetz's task force, anchored at Altafjord in northern Norway, was ordered to intercept and annihilate the British convoy. It seemed like easy prey. With HMS Bulldog and HMS Oribi gone, the British convoy was left with just 6 destroyers for protection. Kummetz's force also included 6 destroyers, but his flotilla escorted far more powerful ships, the pocket battleship Lutzow and the heavy cruiser Admiral Hipper, a heavy cruiser armed with the monstrous 11-inch guns of a battleship. Against these giants, the British destroyers' 4.7-inch guns would be little more than an annoyance. But the British had a trick up their sleeve. While the convoy lacked cruisers in its immediate escort, a distant cover force, Force R, was on hand, commanded by Admiral Robert Burnett and consisting of HMS Sheffield and HMS Jamaica. Their mission was to protect the convoy from a distance, maintaining a low profile to avoid drawing attention. The strategy was simple. Without larger ships nearby, the convoy would be less visible to the Germans. If an attack occurred, Burnett's cruisers, positioned closer to shore, would intercept the German fleet before it could reach the convoy. There was, however, a problem. Due to significant delays caused by the Arctic storm and the missing ships, Force R had overshot Convoy JW 51B's position by more than 30 miles. As Kummetz raced toward the convoy, he slipped through the British trap, with HMS Sheffield and HMS Jamaica completely unaware of the danger bearing down on their charges. Meanwhile, U-354 continued shadowing the British ships. By 4 p.m., Hirschlib had maneuvered ahead of the convoy and into a prime attacking position. Not content to leave the glory to the High Seas Fleet, he fired 3 torpedoes aimed at the tanker and merchant ships in the convoy's center. British lookouts quickly spotted an anomaly in the water, perhaps a torpedo wake. The odds were slim, but they raised the alarm. Sherbrooke immediately ordered the convoy to use a zigzag maneuver to evade the attack. Coordinating more than 20 ships under these conditions was a logistical nightmare, and every second counted. It became clear that the torpedoes were seconds from impact. As the projectiles closed in, the convoy's lumbering ships managed to shift in their zigzag pattern just in time. The torpedoes streaked past, missing every vessel. A collective sigh of relief swept through the convoy, but Sherbrooke knew the reprieve was temporary. A U-boat was in their midst, and now the High Seas Fleet knew exactly where they were. His gut told him they wouldn't escape an interception for long. Oskar Kummetz carried the weight of the entire high seas fleet on his shoulders. Tasked with leading Operation Regenbogen, he was under orders to destroy the next British convoy bound for Murmansk in the Soviet Union, a mission of critical importance. The Soviet forces on the Eastern Front had seemingly endless reserves of manpower, but their war machine relied heavily on the supplies delivered by these convoys. Cutting off that lifeline could tip the scales of the war in Germany's favor. This particular convoy seemed almost too good to be true. Weakly defended and with no cruiser escort in sight, it presented a golden opportunity for Kummetz to strike a decisive blow and prove his worth as a commander. Since the war began, Germany's surface navy had failed to live up to expectations. Hitler, already skeptical of its utility, was growing increasingly disillusioned. The catastrophic loss of the battleship Bismarck in May 1941, sunk after a dramatic Atlantic sortie, and the scuttling of the pocket battleship Admiral Graf Spee following the Battle of the River Plate in December 1939 had devastated morale and shaken confidence in Germany's surface fleet. These losses left Hitler fearful of risking his remaining capital ships, dreading both the propaganda fallout of another defeat and the diminishing deterrent power of the Kriegsmarine. For Kummetz, this was his chance to restore the High Seas Fleet's reputation and demonstrate its worth. Yet, just as he prepared to unleash his task force on Convoy JW 51B, he received an order that struck like a slap in the face, and it came directly from Hitler. Do not engage unless the enemy force is clearly inferior. His fleet had the strength to annihilate the British convoy. However, the cautious leash Hitler had placed on the Kriegsmarine meant Kummetz would have to tread carefully. He was torn between obeying Hitler by playing it safe or seizing this opportunity and redeeming the High Seas Fleet. He would make his choice once he reached the convoy. Kummetz had devised a plan to crush the convoy in a pincer movement. His fleet was split into two groups, Admiral Hipper and 3 destroyers in one, while the Lutzow and the remaining destroyers formed the second. The goal was simple: converge on the convoy from opposite sides on the morning of December 31st and deliver a hammer blow. By 7:18 a.m., Hipper's lookouts caught sight of faint silhouettes against the horizon, hazy forms barely visible through the perpetual Arctic night. It was likely the British convoy, but the murky visibility turned confirmation into guesswork. Still, by 9 a.m., both Hipper and Lutzow, along with their escorts, maneuvered into position, ready to strike. It was the perfect setup for a devastating ambush, but Kummetz hesitated. Hitler's standing orders were clear: avoid unnecessary risks and identify targets first. The fear of misstep was palpable. Instead of striking, he held back, edging closer to confirm the convoy's identity and capabilities. Slowly, Hipper crept forward through the inky void, its presence masked by the gloom. On deck, every man waited for the command to unleash the ship's arsenal. Then Kummetz ordered his crew to fire recognition flares. He had to be sure what he was dealing with. The hissing streaks tore through the dark, illuminating the targets with a faint glow. But no response came from the silhouetted vessels. No flags, no signals, just silence. The tension rose with every second of inaction. Kummetz knew he couldn't play it safe any longer. He gave the order, and Hipper surged forward, led by her 3 destroyers, ready to engage the nearest ship with the full force of their guns. Unaware of the looming danger stalking them through the Arctic murk, Convoy JW 51B pressed on. The gale had finally eased, but the night was endless. Then, out of the gloom, HMS Onslow's watchman spotted a towering shadow, massive and unmistakable. Admiral Hipper was closing in from the rear. The alarm rippled through the convoy. Captain Sherbrooke on HMS Onslow wasted no time. Orders rang sharply through the freezing air as Orwell, obedient and obdurate, rallied to his side. They would meet the German behemoth head-on, buying precious time for the merchant ships. Destroyer Acades was directed to remain with the convoy and begin laying smoke, shielding the vulnerable merchant ships from German eyes. The stillness of the night was shattered by the sudden burst of gunfire as the German destroyers Friedrich Eckholt, Richard Beitzen, and Z-29 began the attack, paving the way for the larger German cruiser. By then, it was clear to Captain Sherbrooke that they were heavily outgunned. Nonetheless, the escorts immediately went into battle mode, laying down even more smoke screens to conceal the merchant ships. The destroyers began exchanging fire with their 4.7-inch guns against their German counterparts. Soon after, the massive Admiral Hipper, in all her 14,000 tons of displacement might, finally broke through the murk and unleashed her 8-inch twin-gas turrets, severely damaging one of the British destroyers. It was pure chaos. In the middle of the snowy darkness, Sherbrooke's flagship, Onslow, almost crashed with Hipper. Nonetheless, Sherbrooke moved, did not shrink away, and fired at the much larger cruiser at point-blank range. Assessing the situation, with Jamaica and Sheffield nowhere in sight, and well aware his destroyers could not put up a prolonged fight with the Germans, Sherbrooke devised a bold tactic. The British ships suddenly turned, appearing to launch a torpedo attack, as the mere threat of torpedoes could force the enemy to retreat. The gamble paid off. Knowing Hitler's very strict orders, Admiral Kummetz temporarily withdrew Admiral Hipper. His crew continued to fire blindly into the smoke and snow. The British escort seized this brief reprieve to reposition and prepare for the next phase of the fight. However, they were well aware Admiral Hipper would turn right back into the action. The remaining German destroyers could not target the merchant ships. The British destroyer's smokescreen obscured much of the convoy. Amidst the haze, the Kriegsmarine forces, again rejoined by Hipper, focused all their might on the one clear target, Acades, her funnels belching thick plumes of smoke as she worked to shield the merchant ships. Admiral Hipper zeroed in on the destroyer, the first salvos tearing right into Acades' hull at 9:42 a.m., and sending shrapnel flying across her decks. A direct hit struck the bridge, taking the lives of her captain and most of the command crew. Within moments, the ship began to take on water, her bow dipping as waves crashed over the shattered forward compartments. Lieutenant Peyton Jones, the senior surviving officer, took command of the ship after the bridge was destroyed. Despite the chaos and damage, Peyton Jones managed to organize his crew to conduct repairs, rescue the wounded, and continue to lay out smoke to keep the merchant ships safe and Acades afloat as long as possible. By then, Admiral Hipper was primed and ready to strike on the Allied flagship. Just past 10 a.m., Admiral Hipper, commanded by Captain Hans Hartmann, launched her second, focusing this ferocious assault on Orwell and Onslow. As her guns roared, massive shells hurtled toward the already battered destroyers. At 10:19 a.m., a devastating blow struck Onslow, wreaking havoc on the bridge and engine room, and injuring Sherbrooke and many other sailors. Amidst the chaos and carnage, the grievously wounded commander, though blinded by the attack, refused to relinquish his command and continued issuing orders to his crew. But the attack was not over. Onslow shuddered under the impact of two more hits from Hipper. The massive 8-inch shells cut through the deck's metal like a hot knife through butter. Orwell's skipper, Lieutenant Commander Nigel Austin, faced a harrowing choice when witnessing the plight of her sister ship. Knowing that a solo attack on Hipper might draw the enemy's fire away from the crippled Onslow, this act of self-sacrifice could spell certain doom for him and his crew. As Austin weighed his options, just as he was about to give the order to engage with Hipper, the German cruiser suddenly turned away, vanishing into a blinding snow squall, her silhouette swallowed by the swirling snow. When Kummetz could have delivered the final blow, his constant fear of disobeying Hitler's orders and the looming possibility of a British destroyer launching a torpedo attack amid the chaos made him decide to once again play it safe. A small respite allowed the true extent of Onslow's wounds to become apparent. 40 of her brave crew were lost or injured. Still blinded by the strike, Captain Sherbrooke had no choice but to relinquish command to Obedient, entrusting the convoy's safety to his fellow destroyers. As the battered Onslow limped back to the convoy, her decks slick with blood and her superstructure riddled with gaping holes, the rest of the group knew that while they had weathered this particular storm, the battle was far from over. Not long after their attack, at 10:46 a.m., Admiral Hipper pulled north of the convoy, her lookout spotted across Bramble. As the Halcyon-class minesweeper, still combing the icy waters for convoy stragglers, bumped into a German cruiser 25 times its weight, her crew, knowing full well what was about to happen, quickly reported the enemy's location and fired a single round from her modest 4-inch guns. But it was no use. Seconds later, Admiral Hipper and the destroyer Friedrich Eckholt unleashed a massive barrage that annihilated the tiny ship within only 6 minutes of cannon fire, leaving no survivors. As the destroyer finished off the Allied ship, Hipper turned her attention southward, targeting the British destroyers Obedient and what remained of Acades. Despite the damage, her crew heroically continued laying one more smokescreen to shield the convoy, even as the ship began to founder. Eventually, the effort proved too much, and Acades also succumbed to her wounds, sinking into the icy waters at 1 p.m. The trawler Northern Gem, braving the chaos, managed to rescue many of Acades' crew in a desperate operation. With the situation worsening by the minute, only backup could save JW-51B now. As the destroyers Onslow and Orwell bravely engaged the German cruisers Hipper and Lutzow in the freezing Arctic waters approximately 30 miles away, the British cruisers HMS Sheffield and Jamaica were rushing to aid the convoy. Initially, Admiral Burnett, commanding the cruisers aboard Sheffield, misinterpreted radar signals, delaying their departure and granting the Germans an initial advantage. It wasn't until all hell broke loose and Sherbrooke radioed his position and situation that Force R sprang into action. Force R's crew could see the distant flashes of gunfire, but there was nothing they could do to save Acades and Onslow. Though built under the constraints of the Washington Naval Treaty, their triple 6-inch guns, mounted on 4 turrets, were ready to make their mark, if they could make it in time. Sailing at full speed, the Sheffield and Jamaica pushed their engines to the limit. As the gap between the cruisers and the raging battle gradually closed, officers pored over radar screens and charts, calculating the fastest route to intercept the enemy while avoiding potential U-boat ambushes. The fate of the convoy, and perhaps the outcome of the war effort, hung in the balance as Sheffield and Jamaica navigated the treacherous Arctic waters. As smoke on the horizon signaled the intensity of the ongoing engagement, and as the cruisers drew closer, the crews finally heard the sound of gunfire that began echoing across the ice-water waves. The German plan for the Barents Sea pincer movement to trap and destroy Convoy JW-51B was a bold gamble. But as the chaos of battle unfolded, nature also played a key part in unraveling their carefully laid strategy. While Hipper plunged right into battle from the very first moment, drawing the British destroyers and cruisers into a desperate fight, Lutzow struggled to join the action. Her commander, Captain Zerzay Rudolf Stange, was hindered by poor visibility, drifting smoke, and the restrictive orders from Hitler to avoid unnecessary risks. At around 11 a.m., as they neared from the south, ready to perform the pincer movement, Lutzow spotted ships between 3 and 7 miles away. Her 11-inch guns had a range of 15 miles. Faced with this dilemma, Stange made a fateful decision. One log entry states, quote, "To avoid observation from the Lutzow being obscured by the snow squalls and smoke drifting south, I decided to proceed at slow speed in the vicinity of the convoy, clear of the snow squalls, in order to take advantage of opportunities for attack as visibility improved." Unbeknownst to Stange, there were no British warships in the immediate area. What he was seeing were the defenseless merchant ships, and he had a clear shot at them. The escorts were fully engaged in stopping Hipper's assault to the north. However, Stange's cautious approach would prove a costly miscalculation. The firepower of Lutzow, which could have decimated the convoy and possibly changed the course of the battle, remained silent. With the original plan scrapped and failed, Hipper, now isolated and bearing the brunt of the British naval response, was left to fend for herself without the support of her fellow cruiser. Despite being by herself, Hipper could easily annihilate all of the British. By the time it was HMS Orwell's turn to face the wrath of Admiral Hipper, the cruisers from Force R, Sheffield and Jamaica, approached unseen towards the fight, determined to even the odds. Their guns roared to life, sending 3 shells crashing into Admiral Hipper in rapid succession. The heavy blows shook the German cruiser, which had been the convoy's most fearsome threat for hours. This effort damaged 2 of her boiler rooms, reducing her speed to 28 knots. Kummetz's worst nightmare had become a reality. He had engaged a force without knowing its true capabilities. From the north, HMS Sheffield and HMS Jamaica bore down relentlessly, their firepower driving home the attack. Meanwhile, from the south, British destroyers closed in, hemming Hipper in on both sides. With this move, the Allies had unintentionally executed the very pincer movement the Germans had failed to achieve. With the once dominant German ship now facing a coordinated attack from multiple directions, Admiral Kummetz initially thought the shells were coming from another destroyer. However, upon realizing this was coming from 2 new cruisers, Kummetz knew he had to act fast. He ordered his ships to retreat towards the west, hoping to escape the mounting pressure from the Allied forces. But the warships of the JW-51B convoy still had one final blow to make. Amidst the chaos, the low visibility left both sides struggling to distinguish friend from foe, and it was in this confusion that the German destroyers Richard Beitzen and Friedrich Eckholt made a catastrophic mistake. Believing the advancing British cruisers HMS Sheffield and HMS Jamaica to be their own reinforcements, the 2 destroyers confidently fell into formation with them. As soon as Eckholt sidled up alongside, the cruisers opened fire at point-blank range. A thunderous broadside erupted from Sheffield and Jamaica's 6-inch guns, shredding the unsuspecting destroyer. The barrage was swift and devastating, and within minutes, Eckholt was torn apart, breaking in 2 before slipping beneath the frigid waters of the Barents Sea, taking all her crew with her to the bottom of the ocean. Meanwhile, Richard Beitzen, trailing behind, realized the terrible error just in time, and the destroyer's captain ordered an immediate retreat, abandoning Eckholt to her fate and racing into the swirling storm, trying to avoid a similar demise. As the smoke began to clear and the gunfire faded, the true extent of the Allied victory became apparent. With the once mighty German force in tatters and their ships battered beyond belief disappearing from view as they limped back to their base, tails between their legs, Burnett, aboard Sheffield, maintained a watchful eye, shadowing the retreating Germans from a distance to ensure they posed no further threat. Jamaica and Sheffield remained with Convoy JW-51B for the remainder of their journey, ensuring the merchant ships reached their destination at Kola Inlet with no further interference. In the end, all 14 transports successfully reached Russia with their invaluable cargo. For his leadership during one of the war's tensest moments, Captain Robert Sherbrooke, who was left badly wounded and permanently blind in one eye, was awarded the Victoria Cross, who in turn acknowledged the commendation awarded in honor of everyone in his crew. According to Admiral of the Fleet, Lord Tovey, the Battle of the Barents Sea was, quote, one of the finest examples in either of the 2 world wars of how to handle destroyers and cruisers in action with heavier forces. On the other side of Europe, news of the German defeat did not reach Hitler immediately due to a grave miscommunication report that stated the sky was on fire, an allusion to the aurora borealis that was misunderstood by intelligence as confirmation that the convoy had been destroyed. Acting on this incorrect assumption, Hitler triumphantly announced the total destruction of the British convoy in his New Year's Day radio address until the following morning, when a BBC broadcast told the truth. Upon learning that the convoy had arrived intact, the embarrassed leader's fury was unparalleled. He summoned Admiral Erich Raeder, the commander-in-chief of the Kriegsmarine, to the Wolfslayer, his fortified headquarters, for an immediate meeting. What followed was a tirade that lasted over an hour and a half, where an infuriated Hitler declared the Kriegsmarine as wholly inept and accused its sailors of cowardice, incompetence, and treachery. According to him, only the U-boat force had proven its worth. Most conveniently, he ignored how his own orders had restricted German commanders from risking their capital ships, a major contributing factor to the operation's failure. Hitler ordered the immediate scrapping of all 13 of the Kriegsmarine's capital ships. Their guns were to be removed and repurposed as coastal artillery, while the steel would be recycled for other military uses. For Admiral Raeder, who had dedicated over a decade to building Germany's surface fleet, this was the final humiliation, and he resigned. In Raeder's place, Hitler appointed Admiral Karl Dönitz, a staunch submariner who had long argued against investing heavily in surface ships. From then on, Nazi Germany did not commission a single additional capital ship for the remainder of World War II, and a refit of the battleship Gneisenau was abandoned halfway through. The Kriegsmarine attempted only one more capital ship sortie, which in December 1943 ended with the sinking of the battleship Scharnhorst, sealing the fate of Germany's surface fleet and its naval ambitions forever.